People think love begins with fireworks. Mine began with a paper napkin, a streak of vanilla cream, and a single word that refused to leave my heart. Every morning in Manhattan followed the same rhythm for Lucas Bennett. At 5:30, the city was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes while he unlocked the side entrance of the Gilded Whisk, the luxury hotel's award-winning pastry kitchen. Before the lobby filled with executives carrying leather briefcases and tourists chasing perfect vacations, the bakery belonged to him alone. Warm lights glowed against polished marble countertops, industrial mixers hummed like distant rain, and the rich scent of butter, vanilla, roasted almonds, and fresh espresso slowly replaced the cool chill left by the night's air conditioning. It was the only place where Lucas felt completely understood. Sugar followed rules. Dough rewarded patience. Chocolate never judged anyone for where they came from. Unlike people, desserts always became exactly what they were willing to become. Lucas tightened the white apron around his waist, pushed a loose strand of chestnut hair behind his ear, and checked the production board hanging beside the ovens. 200 croissants. 100 fruit tarts. 40 wedding cakes scheduled over the weekend. 3 private tasting menus. Another ordinary day inside one of New York City's most prestigious hotels. He preferred ordinary. Ordinary meant predictable. Predictable meant safe. Most of his co-workers loved gossip almost as much as they loved fresh pastries, but Lucas usually stayed out of both. They called him the quiet one, the baker whose smile appeared only when a recipe came together exactly as planned. He didn't mind. Being underestimated had become strangely comfortable. Around 7 sharp, the lobby outside transformed into organized chaos. Luxury cars lined the curb while guests drifted through revolving doors carrying expensive luggage and steaming coffee. Lucas rarely paid attention anymore until one of the servers hurried into the kitchen with unusually wide eyes. "He's back," she whispered to another employee. "The new CEO." The conversation immediately spread through the kitchen. Faster than the smell of cinnamon rolls. Adrian Cole. The youngest chief executive in the company's history. Brilliant. Reserved. Impossible to impress. Every employee seemed to have heard a different version of the same story. Some claimed he had doubled company profits within 2 years. Others insisted he remembered every employee's name after meeting them once. No one could agree on whether he was intimidating or simply unreadable. Lucas had never spoken to him. From the pastry kitchen's open service window, he occasionally noticed a tall man wearing tailored charcoal suit stopping by the cafe every morning at exactly 7. Always an Americano. Always black. Always the same quiet nod to the barista before disappearing toward the executive elevators. Routine recognized routine. That was all. Until Thursday. The hotel was hosting an exclusive charity brunch attended by celebrities, investors, and city officials. Every pastry had to be flawless. Lucas personally carried a display of miniature strawberry cream eclairs toward the presentation counter, carefully balancing the silver tray as servers rushed around him. Someone called his name from behind. He turned too quickly. One tiny eclair shifted. A ribbon of vanilla cream landed softly against the corner of his mouth. Lucas, another pastry chef, laughed. "Don't eat the display before the guests arrive." He rolled his eyes, smiling despite himself. "I'm saving quality control for later." The kitchen chuckled before everyone returned to work. Lucas reached for a nearby towel without looking up, but another movement stopped him. A hand appeared first. Calm. Steady. Confident. Long fingers held a neatly folded white linen napkin instead of offering it. Lucas looked up. Adrian Cole stood only inches away, his expression composed as though silence itself belonged to him. Neither of them spoke. The bustling kitchen around them somehow faded beneath the soft clatter of dishes and distant conversations from the dining room. Adrian's gray eyes rested on Lucas with quiet focus, not cold, not warm, simply attentive in a way Lucas couldn't explain. Instead of handing over the napkin, Adrien gently lifted it and brushed away the small streak of vanilla cream near Lucas's lips with careful, almost absent-minded precision, the gesture so natural it lasted barely a second. Lucas forgot to breathe. No teasing smile followed. No apology. No explanation. Adrien folded the napkin once more, set it neatly beside the tray, and studied Lucas for another heartbeat that somehow felt much longer than it should have. Then, in a voice low enough that no one else could possibly hear above the kitchen noise, he leaned forward just enough to leave a single quiet word between them. Mine. Before Lucas could process what he had heard, Adrien turned toward the dining room with the same composed stride he had entered with, leaving behind nothing except a neatly folded napkin, a racing heartbeat Lucas couldn't understand, and the unsettling feeling that the stranger who had barely spoken to him somehow already knew far more than he should. Lucas spent the rest of the brunch moving entirely on instinct. His hands measured flour, folded pastry dough, and glazed fruit tarts with the same precision they always had, yet his thoughts refused to stay inside the kitchen. That single word replayed over and over, refusing to lose its weight. Mine. It made no sense. Adrien Cole barely knew his name. They had never shared a real conversation. Lucas convinced himself he had misheard it, that the noise of the kitchen had twisted another sentence into something impossible. It was the only explanation that felt reasonable. Unfortunately, every time he looked toward the dining room, he found Adrien seated at the same corner table, drinking his black Americano while occasionally glancing toward the pastry kitchen with the calm expression of someone carrying no unanswered questions at all. Lucas, meanwhile, had accumulated enough questions to fill the entire hotel library. The following morning he made a simple decision. He would avoid Adrien completely. It sounded easy until 7 o'clock arrived with almost mathematical precision. Lucas suddenly volunteered to decorate cakes in the back kitchen instead of delivering fresh pastries to the cafe. 10 minutes later the executive pastry chef unexpectedly switched assignments because one of the junior bakers had called in sick. Lucas found himself carrying breakfast desserts toward the exact cafe he had hoped to avoid. Adrien was already there. Their eyes met for less than a second before Lucas immediately focused on arranging croissants with exaggerated concentration. Adrien simply thanked the server, accepted his coffee, and left without acknowledging him. Lucas released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Good, he thought. Yesterday must have been a misunderstanding. Then another employee hurried into the pastry kitchen carrying a handwritten request. Mr. Cole asked if today's almond pastries were made by the same baker as yesterday. Every head turned toward Lucas. Looks like somebody appreciates your work, one cook teased. Lucas forced a laugh that sounded far less convincing than he intended. He probably just likes almonds. The comments continued throughout the morning, and Lucas found himself wishing expensive executives preferred instant oatmeal instead. Over the next week his carefully planned avoidance strategies became increasingly ridiculous. On Monday he entered through the employee entrance 20 minutes earlier than usual, only to discover Adrien inspecting renovations in the same hallway. On Tuesday Lucas decided to take lunch on the rooftop garden, believing executives never visited staff areas, until Adrien unexpectedly arrived for a meeting with the hotel's landscape designer. Wednesday brought another surprise when Lucas hid inside the culinary library to organize recipe binders, only to learn that Adrien had chosen the quiet room for a conference call because it overlooked Central Park. None of these encounters lasted more than a minute. Adrien never forced conversation. He never repeated that mysterious word. Sometimes he simply nodded politely before continuing whatever business had brought him there. Somehow that restraint made everything even more unsettling. Lucas finally complained during a coffee break. "Does your boss secretly own every hallway in this building?" he asked his friend and fellow pastry chef Mia. She laughed into her paper cup. "He practically owns the building." "Lucas. That is not what I meant." "Then what do you mean?" Lucas opened his mouth before realizing he could not explain without sounding completely unreasonable. How was he supposed to describe a man who barely spoke yet somehow disrupted every carefully organized thought in his head? Nothing, he sighed. Forget it. Mia smiled knowingly. You are terrible at pretending nothing is bothering you. Lucas changed the subject immediately. 2 days later the hotel prepared for a prestigious dessert competition hosted inside the grand ballroom. Representatives from culinary schools, luxury restaurants, and hospitality magazines would attend. Every department worked under enormous pressure to create a flawless presentation. Lucas spent nearly 4 hours building an elaborate sugar sculpture inspired by the New York skyline. It was delicate work requiring absolute concentration. As he carefully adjusted a transparent sugar bridge connecting 2 crystal towers, a familiar voice sounded behind him. Interesting choice. Lucas turned too quickly. You startled me. Adrian stood several feet away, hands folded behind his back. That was not my intention. Lucas carefully steadied the sculpture before answering. Most executives inspect budgets. You inspect pastry displays. Successful hotels are remembered by details. Lucas folded his arms. Then you probably noticed this display is still unfinished. Adrian nodded once. Perfection usually is. The answer irritated Lucas far more than it should have. With respect, Mr. Cole, not everything improves because someone keeps watching it. Silence settled between them. Adrian neither defended himself nor looked offended. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest suggestion of a smile. That explains a great deal, he replied quietly before turning away. Lucas stared after him in complete confusion. He had expected disagreement. Perhaps even criticism. Instead, Adrian sounded almost pleased. Before Lucas could decide whether that was comforting or deeply concerning, one of the event coordinators rushed across the ballroom with visible panic. Lucas, she called breathlessly, the tasting menu for tomorrow has changed. Mr. Cole personally requested that only you prepare the private dessert course. Lucas stared at the event coordinator for several seconds before finally asking, Are you certain she said my name? The coordinator nodded without hesitation. Personally requested. Those were the exact words. Before Lucas could ask another question, she hurried away to solve a dozen other problems, leaving him standing beside the unfinished sugar sculpture with even more confusion than before. Every instinct told him to refuse. Preparing desserts for the hotel's most important guest meant spending more time around Adrian Cole, something he had unsuccessfully tried to avoid for more than a week. Unfortunately, refusing a direct request from the chief executive was not a realistic career decision. The following afternoon the private tasting was arranged inside an elegant dining room overlooking Central Park. The table held only 4 place settings for Adrian and 3 international investors considering a partnership with the hotel group. Lucas remained inside the open demonstration kitchen connected to the room, where guests could observe the preparation without interrupting the service. It was supposed to highlight craftsmanship. Instead, it made Lucas feel unusually self-conscious. He focused on the desserts one plate at a time. A honey vanilla mousse shaped like a blooming flower. Caramel lace balanced with fresh berries. Citrus glaze polished until it reflected the overhead lights. Baking had always quieted his mind. Today it almost succeeded. The investors complimented every course, discussing flavors with genuine enthusiasm. Adrian spoke very little, listening more than talking, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about ingredients or preparation methods. Lucas noticed something unexpected. Adrian never interrupted anyone. He thanked every server who approached the table. He listened carefully before answering questions. None of those qualities matched the intimidating image employees whispered about throughout the hotel. After the final dessert was served, Lucas began quietly cleaning his station while the meeting continued. Nearly 30 minutes later, the investors stood, exchanged handshakes, and departed for another appointment. Silence settled over the room again. Lucas collected empty plates without looking toward the dining table. The lavender was your idea. Adrian's voice broke the silence. Lucas glanced up. Excuse me. Most pastry chefs would have used vanilla alone. You added lavender. Lucas hesitated. It softens the sweetness without hiding it. Adrien nodded once. Exactly. That single word carried genuine appreciation rather than casual politeness. Lucas found himself unexpectedly smiling. Most people only notice the decoration. Most people are distracted by appearances. Lucas laughed quietly before he could stop himself. That sounds like something a chief executive would say. Adrien surprised him again. It sounds like something someone learns after making expensive mistakes. The answer erased part of the invisible wall Lucas had built around him. For the first time, Adrien sounded less like the leader of a global company and more like an ordinary person remembering difficult lessons. Lucas finished stacking the last plate. Well, thank you for noticing the lavender. Adrien rose from his chair. Thank you for including it. It was a remarkably ordinary conversation. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than all of their strange encounters combined. Over the following days, the atmosphere between them shifted almost imperceptibly. Adrien continued visiting the cafe every morning, but now he occasionally asked simple questions. Which pastry had just come out of the oven? Why croissants required so many layers? Whether local honey tasted different during each season. Lucas answered cautiously at first, then more naturally as he realized Adrien genuinely wanted to learn rather than simply make conversation. One rainy Thursday morning Lucas arrived carrying a soaked backpack after walking 4 city blocks through an unexpected summer storm because the subway had temporarily stopped running. He quietly changed into his uniform, hoping nobody would notice his damp clothes. Less than an hour later a hotel assistant entered the pastry kitchen carrying a neatly folded umbrella and a small insulated cup. Mr. Cole asked me to bring these, she explained. He noticed you arrived without one. Lucas accepted them in stunned silence. The cup contained hot chamomile tea with a handwritten note attached to the lid. It simply read, "Long mornings deserve warm endings." There was no signature. None was necessary. Lucas looked toward the cafe through the service window. Adrien was already leaving for another meeting, speaking with 2 executives while buttoning his charcoal jacket. He never looked back toward the kitchen. He never waited for thanks. Mia noticed the tea almost immediately. Someone is paying attention, she teased. Lucas shook his head. He is probably just being polite. Lucas, she replied with a knowing smile, chief executives usually do not send tea to employees because of the weather. Lucas wanted to disagree, but he could not explain away the quiet kindness any better than he had explained the mysterious word from their first meeting. That evening, while finishing inventory after closing, he opened his locker to store the empty teacup before going home. Resting neatly on top of his folded apron was a small hardcover notebook bound in dark blue leather. There was no card, no wrapping paper, no explanation. Curious, Lucas opened the first page. Written in careful handwriting were only 8 words. Every great baker deserves a place for new dreams. His heartbeat quickened as he turned another page, only to discover a pressed white flower tucked carefully between the blank sheets, and before he could gather his thoughts, he heard calm footsteps stopping just outside the locker room door. Lucas slowly closed the notebook, his fingertips resting on the dark blue cover while the faint sound of footsteps lingered outside the locker room. He expected the person to knock. Instead, the footsteps paused for a brief moment before continuing down the hallway without interruption. By the time Lucas stepped outside, the corridor was empty except for the warm glow of evening lights reflecting across polished marble floors. Whoever had been there had already disappeared. He looked down at the notebook again, then carefully placed it inside his backpack before heading home. The next morning the city welcomed another clear sunrise, and the gilded whisk returned to its familiar rhythm of fresh bread, steaming coffee, and early deliveries. Lucas told himself the notebook had simply been a thoughtful professional gift. Nothing more. It was easier to believe that than to admit someone had quietly noticed details about his life that he rarely shared with anyone. Still, every time he reached into his locker for a recipe card, his eyes drifted toward the blue cover resting neatly beside his apron. During the following week another side of Adrien gradually revealed itself without either of them acknowledging it directly. Employees throughout the hotel often stiffened whenever the chief executive appeared. Department managers hurried to straighten paperwork. Supervisors reviewed schedules twice before handing them over. From a distance Adrien remained exactly what everyone described. Calm. Demanding. Efficient. Meetings started on time. Reports were expected without excuses. Mistakes were corrected with direct honesty instead of comforting words. Lucas occasionally watched him crossing the grand lobby surrounded by executives carrying tablets and folders, his posture perfectly composed, his expression impossible to read. It was easy to understand why people believed he was distant. Yet Lucas had begun noticing moments nobody else seemed to see. One afternoon a nervous young bellman accidentally dropped an expensive suitcase while rushing through the entrance. The poor employee immediately apologized, clearly expecting severe criticism. Adrien simply bent down, helped him lift the luggage, and quietly reminded him that hurrying usually created more problems than it solved. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds before Adrien continued toward the elevators as though nothing unusual had happened. Another evening Lucas passed the hotel courtyard while leaving work and noticed Adrien sitting alone on a wooden bench instead of inside his luxury office. His suit jacket rested beside him while he fed tiny pieces of bread to a family of sparrows gathered beneath a flowering tree. The birds approached without fear, hopping across the stone path as Adrien watched them with an expression Lucas had never seen before. There was no trace of the intimidating executive everyone whispered about. Only a quiet man enjoying a peaceful moment before another demanding day continued. Lucas smiled without realizing it. "You are looking at him again." Mia's teasing voice made him jump. "I was looking at the birds." "Of course you were." She laughed. "And I suppose the birds were wearing tailored Italian suits." Lucas rolled his eyes, unable to stop smiling. "You invent stories far too easily." "Not nearly as easily as two people who pretend they barely know each other." Before Lucas could answer, Mia hurried back inside carrying another tray of pastries, leaving him alone with thoughts he preferred not to examine too closely. A few days later Lucas stayed late experimenting with a new dessert recipe inspired by late summer peaches. The kitchen had almost emptied when Adrien quietly entered through the side door. Instead of speaking immediately, he watched Lucas carefully pipe cream onto delicate pastry shells before asking, "Is this another competition recipe?" Lucas shook his head. "No. Just curiosity." Adrien stepped closer to the counter, keeping a respectful distance. "Does curiosity usually keep you working 2 hours after everyone else has gone home?" "Usually." Lucas laughed softly. "Recipes rarely cooperate with business hours." Adrien studied the unfinished desserts before saying, "Neither do worthwhile dreams." Lucas paused. "Was the notebook your idea?" Adrien did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the large windows overlooking the city skyline where thousands of lights had begun glowing against the evening sky. "My grandfather owned a small bookstore," he finally said. Whenever someone discovered something they truly loved, he gave them an empty notebook. Lucas waited quietly. He believed dreams become more real after they are written down. The honesty in Adrien's voice surprised him more than the story itself. People probably do not expect the chief executive of an international hotel group to quote his grandfather's bookstore. Adrien smiled very faintly. "People expect many things. Do they know you feed sparrows after work?" Adrien looked genuinely surprised. "You saw that?" Lucas nodded. "It does not match your reputation." Adrien looked thoughtful before answering. "Reputations are usually built by observers. Character is built when nobody is watching." The words settled comfortably between them. For the first time since they had met, neither silence nor conversation felt uncomfortable. Lucas realized the polished public image Adrian carried through crowded boardrooms was only one small piece of who he really was. Beneath the tailored suits and disciplined routines lived someone who remembered family traditions, noticed small details, quietly encouraged other people, and somehow understood the language of ordinary kindness better than grand gestures. As Lucas reached for another peach to continue experimenting, Adrian's attention shifted toward a framed photograph hanging near the recipe shelves. His expression changed almost instantly, becoming unusually still. "Where did you get that picture?" he asked quietly. Lucas turned toward the photograph in confusion. "My grandmother gave it to me years ago," he replied. "Why?" Adrian stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the faded image with unmistakable recognition, and whispered, "That cannot be possible." Lucas followed Adrian's gaze toward the framed photograph hanging beside the recipe shelf. It was an old picture, slightly faded around the edges, showing a small roadside bakery with flower boxes beneath every window. In front of the building stood Lucas as a smiling 10-year-old beside his grandmother, both covered in flour after a baking contest held every summer in a quiet Connecticut town. Adrian stepped closer without touching the frame. "I know that bakery," he said softly. Lucas blinked in surprise. "It closed years ago." Adrian nodded. "I remember." His voice carried a distant warmth Lucas had never heard before. "When I was 13, my grandfather brought me there after a difficult year. We stopped because I refused to eat anything during the drive." Lucas studied Adrian's face, realizing he was not remembering a place but a feeling. "My grandmother believed nobody should leave hungry," Lucas said quietly. Adrian smiled almost imperceptibly. "She handed me a peach pastry and told me that people could not solve tomorrow's problems with an empty stomach." Lucas looked back at the photograph. "That sounds exactly like her." Neither of them noticed how much time had passed until the kitchen lights automatically dimmed to their evening setting. Adrian finally glanced at his watch. "I should let you finish." Before leaving, he looked at the photograph once more, then at Lucas, as though trying to connect two memories separated by many years. "Some meetings take a long time to make sense," he said before quietly walking away. Lucas remained alone in the kitchen, unable to shake the strange feeling that their lives had crossed paths long before either of them realized it. The following morning began normally enough, but by mid-afternoon something felt different. The hotel's climate control system struggled against an unexpected late summer heat wave, leaving even the marble hallways unusually warm. Lucas assumed the lingering discomfort came from standing beside industrial ovens since dawn. He drank more water than usual, loosened the collar of his chef's jacket during breaks, and continued preparing desserts for an evening charity gala. Yet the strange warmth refused to fade. Instead, it settled beneath his skin like a quiet fever that never fully arrived. His concentration slipped in small but unfamiliar ways. He reached for vanilla and almost picked up cinnamon. He measured cream twice because he could not remember whether he had already done it. Mia noticed first. "Lucas, are you feeling all right?" she asked while arranging macarons in glass display cases. He forced a reassuring smile. "Probably just tired." "You never forget ingredients when you are tired." Lucas wanted to argue, but another wave of dizziness interrupted him. It lasted only a few seconds before disappearing again, leaving him more confused than alarmed. He decided to step outside for fresh air before the evening rush began. The employee courtyard behind the hotel was quiet except for the sound of a small fountain and leaves rustling gently above the brick pathway. Lucas leaned against a stone railing, closed his eyes, and took several slow breaths. The cool breeze helped, but only slightly. For reasons he could not explain, every nearby sound suddenly seemed clearer. Water splashing against stone. Distant laughter from guests entering the lobby. Fresh herbs growing beside the courtyard garden. Even the comforting aroma of bread drifting from the bakery felt unusually vivid. It was not unpleasant, only unfamiliar. You should not be standing in the sun. Lucas opened his eyes to find Adrien approaching with 2 bottles of chilled water. Everyone keeps saying I look worse than I feel, Lucas replied with a small laugh. Adrien handed him 1 bottle. Perhaps they are worried because you rarely slow down. Lucas accepted it gratefully. Their fingers brushed only briefly during the exchange, yet something unexpected happened. The strange restlessness that had followed Lucas throughout the afternoon eased almost immediately. His breathing steadied. The dizziness softened. Even the oppressive warmth seemed to retreat. Lucas frowned slightly, puzzled by how quickly everything had changed. Adrien noticed the expression. Better? Lucas nodded slowly. Actually, yes. Neither of them understood why a simple moment of calm had made such a noticeable difference. Adrien looked thoughtful but chose not to press the subject. Promise me one thing, he said. If you begin feeling unwell again, tell someone instead of working through it. Lucas smiled. That sounds less like an order and more like concern. Perhaps it is both. Before Lucas could answer, an urgent voice echoed from the courtyard entrance. Mr. Cole, the board members have arrived early. Adrien acknowledged the assistant with a nod before turning back toward Lucas. Please take care of yourself. He walked away toward the executive wing while Lucas remained beside the fountain, watching him disappear around the corner. Only after Adrien was gone did the strange warmth quietly return, gentler than before but unmistakably present. Lucas looked down at the unopened bottle of water still resting in his hands, trying to understand why the discomfort had vanished the instant Adrien stood beside him, and why its return now filled him with more questions than fear. Lucas tried to convince himself that exhaustion explained everything. Long hours beside industrial ovens, endless preparations for high-profile events, and too little sleep could easily account for the strange warmth that came and went throughout the day. Yet deep inside, he knew the explanation was incomplete. The feeling always changed in exactly the same way. It faded whenever Adrien stood near him and quietly returned once they were apart. Coincidences were supposed to happen once, perhaps twice. Not every single time. 2 mornings later the hotel hosted its quarterly executive presentation, an event that transformed nearly every conference room into a maze of polished tables, projection screens, and carefully arranged floral displays. The pastry department had been asked to prepare breakfast service for more than 100 corporate guests. Lucas buried himself in work, grateful for a distraction. Fresh croissants emerged from the ovens in perfect golden layers while miniature fruit tarts disappeared from serving trays almost as quickly as they arrived. Everything felt normal until an unfamiliar man entered the kitchen wearing an expensive navy suit and an overly confident smile. You must be Lucas Bennett, he said warmly. I have heard quite a bit about your desserts. Lucas politely shook his hand. Thank you. I am sorry, have we met? Not yet. My name is Victor Hale. He extended a business card bearing the logo of another luxury hospitality group. I oversee culinary development for our eastern properties. Lucas accepted the card with mild curiosity. Congratulations on your expansion. Victor's smile widened. Actually, I came because talented people deserve better opportunities. He lowered his voice slightly. We are opening a flagship hotel on 5th Avenue. Double your current salary. Complete creative freedom. Your own pastry studio. Lucas blinked in surprise. The offer sounded almost unreal. Before he could answer, Victor continued. You have outgrown this place. Everyone knows it. The words should have sounded flattering. Instead, something about them felt rehearsed. Lucas carefully placed the business card into his apron pocket without making any promises. I appreciate the offer, but I am happy here. Victor laughed softly. People often mistake comfort for happiness. At that exact moment Adrien entered through the service doors with 2 senior board members. His expression remained composed, but his eyes immediately settled on Victor. The pleasant atmosphere changed almost instantly. "Mr. Hale," Adrian said evenly. "I was unaware you had business inside my pastry kitchen." Victor turned with effortless confidence. "Professional curiosity." Adrian glanced briefly toward Lucas before returning his attention to Victor. "Recruiting employees during an active event is an unusual definition of curiosity." Victor smiled without embarrassment. "Excellent people attract attention. That is how competition works." Adrian's voice remained calm. "Competition belongs in boardrooms, not employee workspaces." The conversation never became hostile, yet the quiet tension between them was impossible to miss. Victor adjusted his jacket and offered Lucas one last smile. "My offer remains open. Call whenever you decide your future deserves a larger stage." After he walked away, Adrian thanked the kitchen staff for their work before leaving with the board members as though nothing unusual had happened. Lucas expected the strange encounter to end there. Instead, everything became more complicated that afternoon. While organizing recipe files inside the pastry office, Lucas accidentally overheard two hotel executives speaking in the adjacent conference room. The connecting door had not fully closed, allowing every sentence to carry through the narrow gap. Victor timed that perfectly, one voice said. "If Bennett leaves, Adrian loses the entire dessert program before the international review." Another voice answered with quiet satisfaction. "That is only the beginning. Investors trust Adrian because he keeps attracting exceptional people. Remove the people, weaken the reputation." Lucas stood completely still. The conversation continued. "The board is already questioning whether Adrian is too emotionally invested in employee decisions. Especially one particular employee." A brief silence followed before both men laughed quietly. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. They were not discussing pastries or business strategy anymore. They were discussing Adrian. And somehow, they were discussing him as well. He carefully stepped away from the office before anyone noticed his presence. The cheerful hotel lobby suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though invisible conversations had been happening around him long before he realized it. That evening, unable to quiet his thoughts, Lucas finally searched the internet for Victor Hale. What he discovered surprised him even more. Victor had once served as Adrian's closest business partner nearly 6 years earlier before leaving the company under mysterious circumstances that no public article fully explained. Some reports described it as a professional disagreement. Others hinted at a deep personal betrayal involving confidential projects and trusted relationships. None of them revealed the complete truth. Lucas closed his laptop slowly. The generous job offer no longer felt like an opportunity. It felt like a carefully planned move in a much larger game. Just then his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. A calm female voice spoke immediately. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Eleanor Brooks. I have worked for the Cole family for over 20 years. There are important things about Adrian that you deserve to know before someone else tells you first. If you truly want the truth, meet me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Bring the photograph from your grandmother's bakery. Do not mention this conversation to anyone." Lucas barely slept. Eleanor Brooks' phone call echoed through every quiet hour of the night until sunrise painted Manhattan in pale gold. At exactly 8 o'clock he arrived at a small cafe several blocks away from the hotel, carrying the framed photograph from his grandmother's bakery wrapped carefully inside a cloth bag. Eleanor was already waiting by the window. She appeared to be in her late 60s, dressed elegantly in a navy coat, with kind eyes that carried the calm confidence of someone who had witnessed decades of difficult decisions. She smiled gently as Lucas approached. "Thank you for coming," she said. Lucas placed the photograph on the table. "You said there were things I deserved to know." Eleanor carefully studied the faded picture before tracing one corner of the frame with her fingertips. "Your grandmother changed a frightened boy's life with a single peach pastry." Lucas immediately understood who she meant. Eleanor continued softly. Adrien never forgot that afternoon. His grandfather had just received devastating medical news, and Adrien blamed himself for being unable to fix anything. Your grandmother welcomed two strangers without asking who they were or why they looked so broken. She reminded Adrien that kindness never asks for permission. Lucas stared at the photograph in silence. Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed another picture, this one newer but unmistakably taken at the same bakery years ago. A young Adrien stood beside his grandfather, smiling with flour on his sweater while Lucas' grandmother laughed in the background. He kept this picture all these years, Eleanor explained. When he recognized your photograph in the pastry kitchen, he finally understood why your smile had always felt familiar. Lucas struggled to absorb everything at once. Why did nobody tell me? Eleanor sighed. Because Adrien believes gratitude loses its meaning when it demands recognition. Before Lucas could respond, Eleanor's phone vibrated. Her expression immediately changed. We have a problem. She looked directly at Lucas. Victor has convinced several board members that Adrien has allowed personal feelings to influence executive decisions. This morning they intend to force an emergency vote during the international review. Lucas felt his heartbeat quicken. Can Adrien stop them? Eleanor slowly shook her head. Not alone. Less than 30 minutes later Lucas hurried back toward the Gilded Whisk, where the annual International Hospitality Review had already begun. Investors, journalists, culinary critics, and board members filled the grand ballroom. The atmosphere appeared polished on the surface. But beneath every polite conversation tension quietly spread through the hotel. Inside the executive conference room Victor confidently presented documents questioning Adrien's leadership while suggesting immediate structural changes. Through the open ballroom doors Lucas caught sight of Adrien standing before the board with his usual calm posture, answering every question with measured professionalism despite the obvious pressure surrounding him. Lucas realized this was not simply a business meeting. It was the defining moment that could reshape Adrien's future. At almost the same instant, Mia rushed into the pastry kitchen looking alarmed. Lucas, someone changed tomorrow's signature dessert presentation. She handed him a printed menu. Every recipe credited to Lucas had been replaced with generic alternatives. Who approved this? Lucas asked. Nobody knows, Mia answered. The files were altered this morning. Lucas immediately understood. It was another move designed to weaken Adrien by dismantling the very culinary program that had distinguished the hotel. Instead of panicking, Lucas took a deep breath. Help me gather everyone. Within minutes the pastry team assembled around the central kitchen island. We are making the original menu, Lucas said firmly. Exactly as planned. Nobody questioned him. Every baker immediately returned to work with renewed determination. Butter melted. Chocolate tempered. Fruit was sliced with practiced precision. Sugar decorations rose into delicate skylines while ovens filled the kitchen with comforting warmth. The entire department moved together with remarkable unity, each person protecting another's timing without needing detailed instructions. Upstairs, Adrien calmly defended his leadership before increasingly skeptical board members. Downstairs, Lucas and the pastry team quietly protected the work Adrien had spent years encouraging. Neither side could succeed without the other. Less than 2 hours later servers carried the completed desserts into the international tasting event exactly on schedule. Culinary critics praised the presentation before even taking their first bite. Investors applauded the originality of the menu. Journalists photographed every plate. Victor's carefully arranged narrative began unraveling one compliment at a time. Adrien finally looked toward the ballroom entrance just as Lucas stepped into view carrying the final dessert himself. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for the first time since they had met, neither uncertainty nor misunderstanding stood between them. Adrien offered the smallest grateful nod. Lucas answered with one of quiet confidence. Together, without planning it, they had protected everything that mattered most. Yet just as relief began settling over the room, one of the senior board members rose from his chair holding a sealed envelope. His expression was grave. "Before we conclude today's review," he announced, "there is one final document that every member of this board must see. It concerns Mr. Adrian Cole, and it changes everything." The conference room fell completely silent as the senior board member slowly opened the sealed envelope. Every executive, investor, and department director watched without speaking. Victor Hale leaned back with quiet confidence, clearly expecting the contents to strengthen his position. Adrien remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, while Lucas stood near the ballroom entrance, every instinct telling him that whatever happened next would reach far beyond a simple business decision. The board member removed several documents before stopping unexpectedly. His eyes moved across the pages once, then a second time. The confidence in his face slowly disappeared. "These records," he said quietly, "are not accusations." Confused murmurs spread around the room. He continued reading. "These are confidential reports documenting multiple anonymous educational grants, employee emergency funds, and family assistance programs created over the last 6 years." He looked directly at Adrien. "Every contribution was approved under a private foundation without your name attached." Another board member accepted the folder and reviewed the documents himself. The foundation paid medical expenses for employees' relatives, funded culinary scholarships, restored community bakeries, and financed apprenticeship programs across the state. He looked genuinely surprised. Why was none of this ever announced? Adrien answered calmly. "Because charity should not become advertising." The room remained silent again, but this time for an entirely different reason. Victor's confident expression began to crack. "That proves nothing," he interrupted. "Generosity does not excuse poor leadership." Before anyone else could respond, Eleanor Brooks entered carrying another folder. "Then perhaps these will." She distributed financial reports to every voting member. The anonymous complaint submitted against Mr. Cole originated from Mr. Victor Hale's consulting office. Victor immediately stood. "That is ridiculous." Eleanor remained composed. "Digital verification has already confirmed the source. The altered pastry schedules, recruitment attempt inside hotel property, and unauthorized document revisions all originated through accounts connected to your consulting firm." One investor quietly closed his folder. "So the instability inside this company was manufactured." Another nodded. "To lower confidence before acquisition negotiations." The realization spread through the room almost instantly. Victor attempted another explanation, but nobody interrupted him because nobody appeared willing to believe him anymore. Adrien never celebrated. He never criticized Victor or reminded anyone that he had been right. Instead, he simply thanked the board for reviewing every document carefully. That unexpected restraint affected the room far more than any dramatic speech could have. As executives gradually left the conference room, Lucas quietly slipped back toward the pastry kitchen, believing the crisis had finally ended. He preferred returning to familiar recipes over standing beneath curious stares. Halfway down the hallway he heard steady footsteps behind him. "Lucas." He stopped. Adrien approached without his jacket, his sleeves neatly rolled to his forearms after the long meeting. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The hallway around them had become unusually quiet as employees returned to their departments. "You knew something was wrong," Adrien finally said. Lucas nodded. "I overheard enough to realize someone wanted your work to fail. Yet you stayed." Lucas looked down briefly before answering. "Because leaving would have made their story true." Adrien smiled with unmistakable warmth. "Thank you." Lucas shook his head gently. "You do not need to thank me. You were protecting everyone here long before anyone realized it." Adrien took another step closer, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Most people only saw the executive." "I almost did too," Lucas admitted. "Then I started noticing everything else." Adrien laughed quietly, the sound surprisingly relaxed after such a difficult day. The sparrows? The tea? Lucas smiled. The notebook. The pastry questions. The way you remember details nobody else notices. Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting Lucas's gaze again. There was another reason. Lucas waited patiently. When I recognized your grandmother's bakery, I realized I had spent years searching for a place that made me feel the same way it did that afternoon. His voice softened. I did not expect to find that feeling again inside a hotel kitchen. Lucas felt his heartbeat quicken, not from uncertainty this time, but from understanding. The strange comfort he had felt whenever Adrian stood nearby suddenly seemed less mysterious. It felt familiar, almost inevitable. Without thinking, Lucas reached into his backpack and removed the blue notebook Adrian had given him. He opened to the first blank page. I finally know what I want to write. Adrian looked at him curiously. Lucas smiled. Sometimes the best recipes are not desserts. Adrian's expression brightened with quiet relief. At that exact moment Victor appeared at the far end of the corridor collecting the last of his belongings before leaving the building. His eyes settled briefly on Lucas, then on Adrian standing beside him. Whatever argument he had intended to make disappeared. Adrian calmly stepped forward until he stood beside Lucas rather than across from him. The gesture was simple, natural, and unmistakable. He did not raise his voice. He did not challenge anyone. Looking directly at Victor, then gently back at Lucas, Adrian said with complete certainty, some things are worth protecting, and I will never apologize for standing beside the people who matter to me. Victor silently turned away and walked toward the exit without another word. Lucas looked at Adrian, speechless, while the warmth that had troubled him for days finally settled into quiet peace. Before either of them could say anything more, Mia came running down the hallway with visible excitement. Lucas, Adrian, she called, barely catching her breath. You both need to come to the lobby right now. There is someone waiting downstairs who says this hotel belongs to the future, and that future starts with both of you. Lucas and Adrian exchanged puzzled glances before following Mia through the grand lobby. The afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass windows, casting warm reflections across the polished marble floor. Waiting near the entrance stood Eleanor Brooks beside an elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes. He leaned lightly on a polished wooden cane, yet his smile carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime encouraging others to dream. Eleanor introduced him simply. This is Samuel Whitmore. He serves on the independent foundation that supports culinary education across the country. Samuel stepped forward and extended his hand toward Lucas before turning to Adrian. I have been watching both of you for quite some time. Lucas looked surprised. Watching us? Samuel nodded warmly. Not as individuals. As partners who simply did not know they were already building something together. He handed Adrian a leather portfolio. Inside rested architectural drawings of a beautiful open kitchen connected to a neighborhood bakery, a teaching studio, and a community cafe filled with natural light. Lucas stared at the sketches in disbelief. What is this? Samuel smiled. Your future, if you choose it. Adrian looked equally surprised. Samuel continued, years ago, your grandfather often told me that successful businesses should leave behind more than profit. They should leave behind opportunity. Before he passed away, he asked our foundation to support a project where experienced chefs could mentor young people who never believed they belonged in professional kitchens. When I heard about the bakery in Connecticut, the scholarships, the foundation, and the remarkable pastry chef who inspired everyone around him, I realized his dream had finally found the right people. Lucas slowly turned another page. Every classroom overlooked a working bakery. Every apprentice station had been carefully designed. Even a small reading corner filled with cookbooks reminded him of the notebook Adrian had once quietly left in his locker. Adrian closed the portfolio gently. This was never my plan. Samuel smiled. Sometimes the best plans grow from kindness repeated often enough that people begin believing in it. Several months later, the former warehouse overlooking the Hudson River had become exactly what the drawings promised. The building filled each morning with the comforting aroma of fresh bread, warm cinnamon, roasted coffee, and hopeful conversations. Culinary students practiced beside experienced pastry chefs while neighborhood families gathered around long wooden tables. Nobody asked where someone came from before offering them an apron. Everyone simply baked together. Lucas discovered that teaching brought him as much joy as creating desserts. Every recipe carried a story, and every mistake became another opportunity to learn rather than something to fear. Adrian still managed the hotel group, but every morning before his first meeting he stopped by the bakery with the same black Americano he had always ordered. The routine never disappeared. It simply found a warmer destination. Employees noticed something had changed about both of them. Adrian smiled more often. Lucas laughed more easily. Neither transformation happened overnight, but together they slowly replaced old habits of loneliness with quiet certainty. One autumn afternoon, a nervous teenage student accidentally ruined an entire tray of fruit tarts moments before a community event. The young apprentice looked ready to give up. Lucas gently placed another apron in the student's hands and said the same words his grandmother had once spoken. "Nobody learns with an empty heart." Adrian quietly stepped beside them and added, "And nobody succeeds alone." Together they prepared a fresh batch from the beginning. The second attempt turned out even better than the first. As the evening celebration ended, guests filled the bakery with conversation while children pressed their noses against the dessert display deciding which pastry to choose. Lucas leaned against the front counter watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and amber. Adrian walked over carrying 2 warm peach pastries wrapped in simple paper. Lucas laughed softly. "Those look familiar." Adrian nodded. Some memories deserve repeating. They sat together near the window where the city lights slowly awakened beyond the river. Lucas opened the blue notebook that had once seemed too precious to write inside. Nearly every page was now filled with recipes, sketches, ideas from students, and small moments worth remembering. Only the final page remained blank. He picked up his pen and wrote one sentence. "The sweetest things in life are never made with sugar alone." Adrian read the words and smiled quietly. Without another sentence, he reached over and gently brushed away a tiny streak of flour resting near the corner of Lucas's cheek before placing the folded napkin on the table exactly as he had done the first time they met. This time Lucas did not freeze in surprise. He simply smiled, covered Adrian's hand with his own, and looked out toward the glowing city that had somehow become home. Around them laughter continued, ovens stayed warm, and another group of young bakers gathered around the kitchen island ready to begin tomorrow's lessons. Lucas finally understood that dreams were never measured by awards, titles, or impressive buildings. They were measured by the number of people who felt welcomed after walking through the door. And sometimes a single act of quiet kindness, offered without expecting anything in return, could rise like fresh bread, filling countless lives with hope long after the moment itself had passed.